Let me tell you something about silence that most people get completely wrong. We think silence is empty. We think it's absence, a void where words used to be. But silence, ladies and gentlemen, is never empty. Silence is a mirror. And when an empath, someone who has spent months, maybe years, pouring their emotional energy into a connection, explaining themselves, chasing clarity, trying to bridge a gap that was never theirs to bridge alone, when that person finally goes quiet, something extraordinary happens on the other side of that silence. Because here's the truth about the avoidant. Their entire nervous system has been calibrated around one thing: distance with a safety net. They pull away, but they know somewhere in the back of their mind that the empath is still there. Still reaching, still translating the silence into hope. Still doing the emotional work for both people. That's the deal. The avoidant didn't even know they were making, I get to disappear and you'll still be standing here when I decide to reappear. Now watch what happens when that safety net is removed. The empath goes silent, not out of spite, not as a manipulation tactic. Let's be clear about that. Because this isn't a game of strategy. This is a shift in energy. And for the first time, the avoidant isn't looking at someone else's withdrawal. They're looking at their own. That buffer, that emotional cushion the empath unknowingly provided is gone. And what's left in its place, their own unprocessed fear, their own unexamined patterns, their own reflection staring back at them in a silence they can no longer outsource to someone else's noise. This is psychological gravity, my friends. You cannot avoid yourself forever if there's no one left to perform the avoidance for. That's the mechanism. That's what makes this moment so seismic. The avoidant built an identity around control, around being the one who decides when connection happens and when it doesn't. But control only means something if there's resistance on the other end. The moment that resistance disappears, the moment the empath stops filling the silence with meaning, the avoidant is handed a mirror they cannot look away from. And I want you to sit with this because this is the part that changes lives. Silence doesn't destroy the avoidant. It reveals them to themselves. Maybe for the first time in years, this is why the empath's silence feels louder than any argument, any confrontation, any tearful conversation ever could. Words can be deflected, words can be minimized, reframed, argued with, but silence doesn't give you anything to push against, it just waits. And in that waiting, the avoidant is finally alone with the one relationship they've been avoiding. The longest, the relationship with themselves. So understand this moment for what it truly is. It's not rejection, it's not punishment. It is exposure, pure, undeniable exposure of a pattern that silence has finally stopped protecting. And that right there is where the crumble begins. Now let's go deeper, because there's an irony here that I need you to fully absorb. The avoidant spent the entire relationship asking for space, craving distance, retreating whenever things got too real, too close, too vulnerable. I just need room to breathe, they'd say. And the empath, being who they are, gave it over and over. Stretched themselves thinner and thinner, trying to honor that need, hoping that enough space would eventually bring the avoidant back closer. But here's what nobody tells you about distance. Distance only feels safe when you're the one controlling it. The moment the empath stops chasing, the moment they mirror that same distance back, everything flips. And I mean everything, that space the avoidant always wanted, it's still there. Nothing is physically changed, but now it doesn't feel like freedom. It feels like a door closing. It feels like abandonment. Because the space was never actually about needing room. The space was about needing to know someone would still be standing there when they turned back. Around This is one of the most profound psychological reversals you will ever witness in human connection. The avoidant built their entire strategy around retreat. Retreat was their power move. Retreat was how they protected themselves from feeling too much, needing too much, exposing too much. But strategy only works when the other player keeps playing the old game. The instant the empath changes the rules, not through anger, not through ultimatums, but through quiet, dignified stillness, the avoidant's entire playbook becomes useless. Think about it this way. If you've spent your whole life running from something, and you finally turn around to check how far behind it is, and it's not behind you at all, that's not relief. That's terror, because now you don't know where it went. You don't know if it's coming back. And suddenly the running wasn't about escaping something dangerous. It was about needing to know. Something was still chasing you, still valuing you enough to follow. That's the trap the avoidant has been living in, whether they've ever said it out loud or not. So when the empath finally stops initiating, stops softening the blow, stops being the emotional GPS, guiding the relationship back to center, the avoidant doesn't feel liberated. They feel unmoored because the distance they demanded was never meant to be permanent. It was meant to be tested. And for the first time, no one is failing that test by chasing them down. No one is proving their worth by refusing to let go. This is where you start to see the crumble take physical form. The silence isn't just psychological anymore. It starts showing up in behavior, the overthinking, the checking of the phone, the rehearsed casual text that took 4 attempts to sound unaffected. Because the avoidant is now face to face with a question they never had to ask before. What if the space I wanted is the space I get to keep? And that question, ladies and gentlemen, is one that no amount of distance can help you avoid. So remember this, the fear was never abandonment by someone chasing too hard. The real fear, the buried primal fear, is being let go of by someone who finally stopped. Now I want to talk about control, because if you strip away everything else, the mixed signals, the hot and cold, the pulling close and pushing away, what you're really looking at with an avoidant is a person who has built their entire emotional survival around one thing: control of the distance between themselves and another human being. Not control of the person, control of the space, when to close it, when to open it, when to let someone in just enough to feel the warmth, and when to pull back before that warmth turns into something they can't manage. And here's what's fascinating, that control was never actually about the relationship. It was about regulation. It was the only tool they had to manage an internal experience that somewhere along the way got wired to associate closeness with danger. So they built a system, a very sophisticated, very unconscious system, where they got to decide the emotional temperature of every interaction. Warm today, cool tomorrow, present this week, distant the next. And as long as they were the one adjusting the dial, they felt safe. Now tell me what happens to that system the moment the empath goes silent. It collapses. Not because the empath did anything to force it, simply because the dial is no longer in the avoidant's hand. They can't predict the next move. They can't gauge how much distance is safe because there's no signal coming back to calibrate against no text to interpret, no emotional temperature to read, no reassurance to quietly confirm that the foundation is still there, no matter how far they wander from it. This is where real anxiety enters the picture. And I mean clinical physiological anxiety, not just discomfort, because a nervous system that has spent years managing itself through control suddenly has nothing left to control. And a mind that has never had to sit with true uncertainty in this relationship is now drowning in it. Here's the deeper truth I need you to understand. Control was never strength. Control was armor. And armor only works when you know where the threat is coming from. The moment the empath's silence removes all the familiar cues, the chasing, the check-ins. The gentle prodding, the avoidant is standing there in armor built for a battle that no longer exists. It doesn't protect them anymore. It just weighs them down while they try to figure out an entirely new terrain. This is the psychological unraveling that so many people misread as finally getting through to them. It's not that, it's simpler and more human than that. It's someone who built their identity around being the one who leaves, suddenly confronting what it feels like to be the one who's left uncertain. And uncertainty, for a person wired to control emotional distance, is the one thing they were never equipped to survive gracefully. So understand this. The chaos you may be witnessing in an avoidant after the silence sets in, the erratic behavior, the sudden reappearance, the overcorrection, that's not weakness. That's a control system failing in real time. That's someone discovering, often for the first time in their adult life, that they were never actually in control of connection at all. They were only ever in control of retreat. And once retreat stops working, there's nowhere left to hide. Now, here's something that's going to sound like a contradiction at first, but stay with me, because this is one of the most important truths in this entire conversation. The avoidant, the one who withdraws, who deflects, who insists they don't need much from anyone, is often the most dependent person in the relationship. Not dependent in the way we usually talk about dependency, not clingy, not needy in the obvious sense, but dependent in a quieter, more hidden way. Dependent on being pursued. Dependent on someone else carrying the emotional weight so they never have to reach first. Think about what the empath actually provided, even when it looked one-sided. Every check-in, every moment of patience, every time they absorbed the silence and translated it into they just need space instead of walking away. That wasn't just kindness, that was labor, emotional labor, sustained over time, that the avoidant leaned on without ever having to admit they were leaning on anything. This is the part people miss. Avoidance isn't independence. Real independence doesn't require someone else to manage the relationship's emotional infrastructure while you stay detached from the wiring. What looks like self-sufficiency is often just outsourced vulnerability. Someone else doing the feeling, the reaching, the repairing, so the avoidant never has to build those muscles themselves. So when the empath goes silent, what's actually being withdrawn isn't affection. It's infrastructure. It's the entire support system the avoidant didn't know they were standing on. And when you remove a support system from someone who's never had to build their own, they don't just miss the person, they feel the structural collapse of something they assumed would always be there, holding the relationship together no matter what they did or didn't do. This is why silence from an empath hits differently than silence from anyone else. It's not just quiet. It's the removal of a mechanism that was compensating for a piece of the avoidant they never developed on their own. The ability to sit in discomfort, initiate repair, and stay present without needing to retreat first. And here's the deeper psychological wound this exposes. If you've spent your whole life believing you don't need much from anyone, and then one silence brings you to your knees, that's not proof you were fine all along. That's proof of exactly how much you were relying on someone else to hold what you refuse to hold, yourself. This is the moment self-image and reality stop matching up. The avoidant has to confront a version of themselves they didn't know existed. Someone who feels loss, who is not. In fact, as self-contained as the armor suggested. That's not weakness being created in that moment. That's weakness being revealed. It was always there. It just had a very good disguise, and that disguise was called I don't need anyone. So when you see an avoidant unravel after silence, understand what you're actually witnessing. It's not heartbreak in the traditional sense. It's dependency. Finally visible, standing in the open without the person who used to hide it. And once you've seen your own hidden dependency clearly, you can never fully unsee it again. Now let's talk about defense, because this is where a lot of relationships get stuck in an endless loop that never actually goes anywhere. As long as the empath keeps reaching out, keeps texting, keeps explaining, keeps asking, what did I do wrong, keeps offering one more chance to talk it through, the avoidant never actually has to face themselves. Why? Because they have something to push against. And a person pushing against something doesn't have to look at what's happening inside them. They just have to keep pushing. This is critical to understand. Every deflection, every I'm fine, I just need time. Every disappearing act followed by a casual reappearance like nothing happened. These aren't random behaviors, they're defense mechanisms. And defense mechanisms require a threat to defend against. As long as the empath is out there reaching, hoping, initiating, the avoidant has a threat. Something to deflect, something to minimize, something to create distance from. Their entire nervous system stays in that reactive posture. And reactive postures don't leave room for reflection. You cannot defend and reflect at the same time. The brain simply doesn't work that way. So what happens when the empath goes silent? The threat disappears. And I don't mean the relationship stops mattering, I mean the external pressure stops. There's no one left to deflect, no one left to minimize, no one left to push against. And for the first time, the avoidant is standing in a space with no resistance, no argument, no chase to run from, just stillness, just themselves. This is the moment where deflection simply runs out of fuel. You see, defense mechanisms are exhausting to maintain, but they're even more exhausting to maintain when there's nothing left to defend against. It's like clenching a fist around something that's already gone. The energy that used to go toward pushing the empath away now has nowhere to go except inward. And inward is exactly where the avoidant has spent their whole life avoiding looking. This is where real reflection begins. Not because the avoidant suddenly became enlightened, not because they had some cinematic realization, but because the silence removed every excuse they had to keep looking outward instead of inward. There's no explaining required, no performance necessary, no one to convince that they're fine. Just the quiet, uncomfortable presence of their own patterns sitting right there in front of them, undeniable and unavoidable. And here's the deeper truth beneath all of this. Growth has never come from someone else fighting to be let in. Growth comes from the absence of a fight altogether. When there's nothing to resist, resistance itself becomes pointless. And when resistance becomes pointless, all that's left is honesty. This is why silence succeeds where pleading never could. Pleading gives the avoidant something to manage. Silence gives them something to face. So understand this. The empath's silence isn't cruelty. It isn't a punishment engineered to make someone suffer. It's the removal of a shield the avoidant didn't even know they were holding, and in that removal, for the first time, they're finally standing in front of the one thing they've spent their whole life running from themselves. Now, before we close, I need to redirect something, because if everything I've just walked you through has you thinking, good, let them crumble, let them finally feel what I felt. I want to stop you right there. That is not the point of this moment. That was never the point. If you walk away from this speech thinking silence is a weapon you wield to make someone suffer, you have missed the entire lesson. This moment isn't about the avoidant at all. Not really. It's about the empath. It's about what happens inside the person who finally, after everything, chooses themselves. Let's be honest about what empaths do in relationships like this. They overfunction. They carry two people's emotional weight while calling it love. They interpret silence as an invitation to work harder, dig deeper, give more, as if enough effort could unlock a door that was never actually locked from the outside. It was locked from within. And no amount of overfunctioning was ever going to reach in and turn that key for someone else. So when the empath finally goes quiet, understand what that silence actually represents. It's not a strategy, it's not a power move. It is the sound of someone stepping out of a role they were never meant to carry alone. It is the moment overfunctioning ends and self-respect begins. This is where I want you to sit with something profound. Peace was never on the other side of changing someone else. Peace has never once lived in someone else's growth, someone else's readiness, someone else's healing timeline. Peace lives in the decision to stop waiting for it to come from outside of you. The empath who goes silent isn't hoping the avoidant crumbles so they can say, I told you so. They're not orchestrating a comeback. They are simply finally putting their own energy back where it belongs. Because here's the truth about emotional labor. It was never meant to be a one-person job. And the moment you stop performing both roles in a relationship, you find out very quickly what that relationship actually was. Sometimes what crumbles isn't just the avoidance defenses. Sometimes what crumbles is the entire illusion that love requires abandoning yourself to keep someone else comfortable. So if you take one thing from everything we've covered today, the mirror, the reversal, the loss of control, the exposed dependency, the collapse of defense, let it be this. Your silence was never meant to fix someone else. It was meant to return you to yourself. You are not responsible for someone else's reflection. You're only responsible for how long you're willing to stand there holding the mirror up while they refuse to look. And when you finally set that mirror down, not out of anger, not out of revenge, but out of self-respect, that is not you giving up. That is you growing up. That is you choosing peace over performance and yourself over someone else's timeline. So let them crumble if that's what needs to happen, but you rebuild, you reclaim. You return to the version of yourself that existed before you ever started carrying someone else's, healing on your back. Because in the end, this was never about making the avoidant feel your absence. It was about you finally feeling your own presence again. So let's bring this full circle. We started with a mirror, a silence that finally reflected the avoidant back to themselves. We watched the space they always demanded turn into the space that undid them. We saw a control system built over a lifetime collapse the moment there was nothing left to regulate. We uncovered a dependency so well disguised it wore the mask of independence. We watched defense mechanisms run out of fuel the instant there was nothing left to defend against. And finally, we arrived at the truth underneath all of it, that this was never about the avoidant crumbling at all. It was about the empath rising. Here's what I want you to carry out of this room today. Every single dynamic we've talked about, the withdrawal, the chase, the silence, the collapse, it all comes back to one universal law of human connection. You cannot pour from a self that's been empty trying to fill someone else. You cannot love someone into healing. You cannot silence-proof a nervous system that was never yours to regulate. And you cannot build peace on the foundation of someone else's readiness to meet you there. The empath who finally goes quiet isn't cold. They're not broken. They are, for the first time, whole enough to stop splitting themselves in half for someone who was, never splitting anything to meet them halfway. And the avoidant who crumbles in that silence isn't being punished. They're being handed the one thing they spent their whole life avoiding themselves in a room with no one left to perform for. So here's my challenge to you, whoever you are in this story, if you're the one who's been over-giving, over-explaining, over-functioning, let this be your permission slip to stop. Not out of bitterness, not to teach anyone a lesson, but because you finally understand that your presence was never meant to be a rescue mission for someone else's unhealed places. And if you recognize yourself in the one who withdraws, who controls the distance, who's never had to sit still long enough to feel what's underneath the retreat, let this be the moment you stop running, because the silence isn't your enemy. It's the first honest conversation you've had with yourself in years. Either way, the lesson is the same. The relationship you have with yourself sets the tone for every relationship you'll ever be in. Silence didn't break anything that wasn't already breakable. It simply stopped holding it together. So walk out of here today and ask yourself, where in your life have you been the noise that's covering someone else's silence? And what would happen if you finally let yourself go quiet? Because sometimes the most powerful thing you'll ever say to another human being is nothing at all. Thank you.